our school, we really believe in like relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartedly believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time. The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent.
All right, welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page, and I'm your host. And I'm joined by none other, my partner in crime, Zach Varnell.
That's right.
And we're going to take a little bit of a turn today. I think that we do a lot of big picture dreaming. I think we talk to people about really important stories and relationships in the mentor pieces. But one of the things that I think is of value, and I think what we'll do today is marry some of that to some of the practical application that mentors are dealing with, right? There is a lot of practice and a lot of procedure we get to control, but policy that comes from a little bit higher than us. And so it's important for us to be able to balance both of those things. And so today we'll talk about some graduation pathways, about some changes that are coming down the pipeline, what that will mean for mentors, and how we pivot to make sure that the main thing is still the main thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think when I was a mentor, my biggest fear was not having the knowledge and the expertise to guide my mentees through their high school experience. I relied on people who knew more than me and people who were more experienced. And in most high school models, you have, a guidance counselor, or sometimes in some schools, even a graduation specialist that's up to date on here are the requirements to graduate. And at very least, you have maybe a principal or an assistant principal who has that technical expertise to help guide them through. But what I get excited about is when policy starts to move beyond the technical expertise and meet kids where they're at and provide options for students to demonstrate proficiency and to find a pathway into post-high that makes sense to them. And I feel like that's what, is happening with Washington State and what we're trying to get to. And so I want to share that information with mentors. And I think there's some exciting changes on the horizon that could really connect with how we think about mentorship in the context of navigating your future, which is one of the 4 main goals of mentor groups. So what I'm excited to talk about today is a new graduation pathway that's being currently written and explored through Washington State that's a performance-based pathway. So we're going to talk about that today, what that means, kind of the history of graduation pathways, some House bills that led to some certain legislation, and how that really translates into, like, if I'm a mentor working with a kid, how can I guide them through their high school experience?
So before we dive into, I think, the timeline, like, you're using I think it's always good when we're talking about change that we have clear definitions for things.
Yeah.
You're using the term proficiency. So tell us more, how do I know that a 12th grade student or someone, right, like, who may even have repeated years, how do I know that a person who is exiting high school is quote unquote proficient?
That's a great point. So you could look at this a lot of different ways, because everything has to be measurable. From when you talk about grading, you're talking about measuring students, right? Measuring their ability, measuring their proficiency. And so typically when we talk about state assessments or assessments that are universal or transcend beyond one teacher, you want to try to come up with a standard or like a minimum level of proficiency that says, if you can reach this level, you are proficient enough. And we're not going to dive into the weeds on like the philosophical underpinnings of proficiency. But the idea is that at any point you're going to write a rubric, and sometimes the rubric is qualitative. You could say, if you can show me X, then you are meeting standard. You are proficient in this category. And if you go beyond that, you're exceeding standard. That's kind of the idea. But then sometimes they're quantitative. Like, you can look at state tests and say, we're going to give you this test. You're going to score a certain point level, and above that point level, you'll be proficient. So all of these graduation pathways are usually tests that are quantitative, that demonstrate or at least put in place, like, this is the minimum level of proficiency in order to be deemed by the state as proficient. There's a whole lot that goes into that, and we don't have to dive into that today, but that is the definition of proficiency.
Awesome. Okay. So thank you for giving me that definition.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking about this in a little bit of a timeline because I think people who are on the outside looking in or people who have been in education or education adjacent know that there's been a lot of changes in this conversation.
Yes.
Right. I think some of the things that remain the same is one, you have to have a high school and beyond plan. Two, you have to have a certain amount of credits and those credits must fall in certain buckets.
24 credits. Yep.
Absolutely. But a lot of the change has occurred in this third place. And
Correct.
we've called it the WASL before. We've called it the Smarter Balance Assessment. But there's even further changes that are occurring with this latest House bill. So give us a bit of a timeline. Tell us what current standing looks like.
Yeah. So like you said, there's sort of three components of graduation. You have to have a high school and beyond plan, which is basically your plan as a student to say, this is what I plan to do beyond high school. And that then should backwards lead to you thinking about the classes that you're going to take and the route that you're going to take to graduation that connects to what you plan to do after high school. If I plan on becoming an astronaut or a doctor or going to college, or if I plan on becoming a plumber or working in a trade field, or if I plan on going to community college for 2 years, like that should all dictate what you take in high school to prepare for that. That's the theory. That's the idea. So that's the first piece. The second piece is you have to have 24 credits in Washington State to graduate, and those fall into certain buckets. And we're not going to dive into those today. There's some waivers you can use to waive a number of those credits based on certain circumstances. But then the third pathway has always been the trickiest because that's the one where we attempt to get to some point of like universality. Like if you can say you have credits, you graduate, your school could just pass everyone and you could graduate. We want to try to get to the point statewide where there's some minimum level of proficiency that every student can demonstrate to graduate. So back in the day, when I say back in the day, like 10 years ago, it was really simple. We had one test, you had to pass the test, and everybody had to pass the same test. It was called the WASL, it was called the Smarter Balance Assessment, the SBA. There was, a lot of different names for it. And you had to have two different tests you take. You had to pass the math portion and the ELA portion. And we used to offer it in 10th grade because we wanted kids to have multiple chances to take it. And for the math, many of them had to take it like 3 times in order to pass it, to get to that minimum cut score to pass. And I think what we experienced over time is that was a barrier to graduation that didn't necessarily need to be there. And what I appreciate about where the direction is heading in high school plans, and not just in Washington State, but nationwide, is that we're trying to get away from these quantitative assessments that really identify one type of learner. They really benefit one type of learner, which is a learner that comes into high school and is good at taking tests and can demonstrate their understanding in that format. And then their plan is to go to college and continue in academia. And that's not the case for every student. And we shouldn't be denying a high school diploma for kids that maybe don't fit into that stereotype. So since 1999, I think there was a bill, House Bill 1599, that passed that starting with the class of 2020, they had all these graduation pathways for that third option. So you could stick with the traditional way, which is you pass the test. And if your test, you can meet the minimum test cut score on the SBA in 10th grade for math and ELA, you're done. That's fine. You're finished. But then there's other options. You could take dual credit classes. So if you can pass a college level class that's offered at your high school, and it meets the requirements of a math or an ELA class, that can supplant your test. You could take dual credit exams. So things like, AP or IB exams, that if you score a 3 or higher on an AP test that, is a math oriented class, then you could pass. You could also take college entrance exams. So a lot of students take the SAT or ACT. If you met the SAT at a certain cut score and you didn't pass the SBA, like obviously the SAT should count. Like that's just as much of a standardized test as the SBA is. So that's kind of an easy one. And then they also had transition courses, things like Bridge to College, which we actually tried for a couple years at IDEA. And it can be really helpful for a lot of kids that are sort of bridge classes that help guide them through with a project and a portfolio of demonstrating understanding. So there's been a lot of different pathways that have got it to this point. The other pathway, there's 2 others. The other pathway besides taking a test of some sort was the military pathway. So there's something called the ASVAB. It's a military test that you come out. You have to score minimum proficiency to make it to be accepted into the military. And then the third one is through CTE. So Career and Technical Education has pathways within their disciplines, within their focus areas. And if you complete 2 full credits within that focus area that can count as a CTE sequence and can count in lieu of taking a test. So there are other options now besides taking a test. And if I'm thinking of like, I know myself, I hated taking tests as a kid, and that was never a good way for me to demonstrate understanding. And there's a lot of kids that can really demonstrate high level thinking without having to take a test. And so some of these other pathways have been available since 2020.
And I appreciate you being able to name that as a personal story too, as someone who's getting ready to finish up doctoral work.
Yeah.
Right. So like, I love that there are additional pathways because test taking is not for everyone. There's one way
Right.
to demonstrate proficiency. That's not
Exactly.
the cap. So
And I just remember like when I was a mentor, we worked really hard with seniors to make sure that every kid found a pathway. And we always tried to how to like hack the system with them. Like back when it was just the test, we had to meet with them and try to find all these pathways to get them to fit into so that we could make sure they graduate. Remember, there was this kid, Jay, who was one of my mentees. And I met him every Saturday for, I think it was like 6 weeks in a row, his senior year. We met at the studio where my classes were taught, and we worked on this project that had math components so that we could find an alternative route to get him to graduate. And it was like, Jay, you got to meet me at 10 a.m. tomorrow at the studio, man. Come on, we got to be there. We got to get you to graduate. And that kind of commitment that all of our mentors do for a lot of kids is what gets some of them across the line. And it's just, I mean, it's really cool to see that level of commitment from mentors when they find what ignites the passion for a kid. Jay was never going to show up on Saturday to take a math test. But if you said, hey, we're going to be in the recording studio, but we're going to talk about math and we're going to use this pathway and this is going to help you graduate. It's like, okay, fine, I'll be there. So I think we have to meet kids where they're at, where they want to demonstrate understanding. And that's where this new one that's being worked on right now, I think has a lot of promise.
yeah. So tell us about that. How is this going to function in the world? What is the thing that you're most excited about with it? How will this look at Sammy's SOTA idea?
Yeah. So the answer to that last question, I don't know yet because the rules are still being written. So we're still kind of finding out how this is going to play out. But the newest pathway options, so we kind of listed those three before. You could take a series of tests. You could take the ASVAB and go to the military, or you could do career and technical education, take 2 classes. Mm-hmm. There's another graduation option. It's technically the 8th pathway now that they offer. This started with House Bill 1308 last May. I think it was passed. And it started the process of exploring a performance-based pathway for graduation. And it's basically what I was saying with Jay. It's like, if you can put together a project that has a set of standards that align with math or ELA, and you can demonstrate that the student finished that project and performed something that demonstrated their understanding, that should count as a pathway option. That should be the same as graduating with a cut score on a standardized test. And so this performance pathway option is new. It's being written right now. It started back in May, kind of started the process. They collected feedback over the summer from different stakeholders. I was on a webinar with a bunch of people talking about what that would look like and asking for just feedback on how that should be implemented. And then they went into the process of writing rules. So right now, between September and December, they're with the state legislature writing these rules around what that performance-based pathway will look like. And those rules should come out and be adopted, hopefully early December. And then the plan is in January to make those available to school districts, and they can actually start using them as early as next spring for seniors that are graduating.
So, Zach, why isn't everything performance-based?
That's a good question. I
right?
mean,
like,
it is a funny name.
Define those things, right? Because we were talking about proficiency,
right?
And I don't think at an employer or a place, and I'm playing devil's advocate in this moment,
yeah,
right? As an employer, like if you can write awesome things on a piece of paper, that's fantastic, right? But really, what I'm really going to ask you for is performance. And so, like, why is this new? Why is this novel? How is this?
That's a great question. Yeah. And I think it is a misnomer, because if you're taking a test, that is a performance, right? Everything is a performance-based pathway at some level. Like, you are performing and then earning credit for your performance or demonstrating understanding. So when they say performance-based pathway, it is a little bit of a tricky name for it, and maybe, somewhat misleading. I think the purpose is to give kids flexibility to identify a project that allows them to use their individual performance to demonstrate understanding. And it's very much not a test, not related to a class. So I don't have to take the ASVAB. I don't have to maybe necessarily work through certain CTE pathways if that's not the direction I want to take. But if I can demonstrate that this is something I'm really excited about and I'm going to pour energy and time into it, and it's going to align with math and English language arts, which are the two big topics that we talk about in education. If those two things can be demonstrated through a project or through some sort of performance-based assessment, then we can award kids a high school diploma. That's basically the core idea of it.
Yeah. That's awesome. I think that, anyway, my devil's advocate hat is off now, but I think that that's great to be able to provide an additional pathway where someone can show you the skills in real time. I'm curious about this, right? Because one of the things that I've battled with in my time in education is they would refer to it as the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
Right. And now we're in a space where some of this is being left in the hands of a particular institution to say, here are the things that you can do to now. And if I'm wrong at any point, please tell me to be quiet.
No, you're right.
Right. But there's an importance of maintaining a certain level of expectation, an importance of maintaining a certain level of equity. Right. So it's not just certain groups of students that we're trying to pass through this particular, like how does one do this with integrity?
It's a great question. And I think the key word you talked about was institution, because there's a very fine line when you work in education between providing multiple options for kids and then not creating systemic institutional ways that kids are funneled into those options without having the choice themselves. And it sounds devious, but it's often not. It's often, it happens, and I don't want to say accidentally because that's too soft of a word.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen without some sort of intent. And sometimes if you're not careful and you start naturally falling into the way that institutions operate, which is to create efficient systems, you can funnel kids into pathways without them choosing. And next thing you know, a couple years go by and now you have these very prescriptive pathways where you look up and, wow, this whole pathway over here is only being used by special ed kids, or this whole pathway is only being used by low income kids or by kids that are receiving services from McKinney-Vento, or, whatever subgroup you want to look at. If you're not careful, you could be excluding kids from one of the pathways. I could be a kid that does want to go to college, but I've never been given that opportunity. And I do actually want to show proficiency through taking an ACT test or through taking, an SBA test. And I'm actually really good at math, but just because of the subgroup I'm in and the way that I navigated through my first couple years in high school, all of a sudden I'm being funneled into this performance-based pathway, and maybe college is no longer on the horizon for me because I believe that about myself because of the system that I'm a part of.
Absolutely.
That would be the danger. That's something that would be inequitable, and we have to work really hard to make sure it doesn't happen. And so luckily, the state is actually writing in some legislation to talk about preventing that. So schools that are offering this performance-based pathway, once it gets rolled out in January, they have to share that with families as an option and explain how that would work. And then 2, they have to collect data around who over time is using that pathway. And they have to really understand that if there's trends of certain subgroups of kids using that pathway exclusively, they have to take corrective action to make sure that that's not exclusively happening with one group. And I think that's important work that every school should always be doing, is looking at pathways. The same thing happened in the 90s with career and technical education. Mm-hmm. It used to be called vocational tech. And it was a great thing that high school started offering vocational classes, another way of learning. But with the push to get every kid to go to college, you had this alternative route. The easiest system that the institution created was, let's just take all the kids that are not making it into college and push them over to this other pathway called vocational education. If you can't hack it in the college-bound path, you belong over here. And now we don't have to count those kids against our numbers of, they're in the vocational pathway. We don't have to worry about getting them to college.
Yeah.
And that happened naturally at a lot of schools across the country and became a big problem. And then there was this big push to sort of break up what we call vocational education, call it career and technical education, and do something different. So that it happens all the time in education if you're not careful. And you have to be aware of who's using those pathway options and those programs, and make sure that systems aren't the things that are delineating where you end up with based on the things that you have access to as a student.
And I believe that this is way too early to ask, but like, what does intervention look like if we find in the data that?
That's a good question. I would say you always have to look at the systems that are providing those. I mean, the thing I appreciate about our model and that I think is so important about mentor group is that you have a mentor with an intentionally diverse group of kids. And when I say diverse, I mean age level diverse. They have 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th graders. Mm-hmm. We work really hard to make sure mentor groups are a representative proportion of the whole school. They're not like, oh, all of our AP kids are in one mentor group and all of our like vocational tech kids are another group. We don't do that. We intentionally make sure that doesn't happen. So if I'm a mentor counseling some of my students, I have to be aware of all the pathway options. And I think the system that's set in place by having mentors with diverse groups, I think naturally safeguards against counseling kids into one of these channels. The worst thing you could do is say, well, I know that these amount of kids are going to be in a CTE pathway or performance-based pathway. Let's put all those kids with one mentor, because then they only have to know that one system. And sure, that makes more sense. It's more efficient because now you only have to train that one mentor on the performance-based pathway instead of everyone, which is a lot more complicated. But now you've created a track, and that track now only serves one group of kids. The way that we operate and why it's so important to share this kind of information and these changes around graduation with our mentors is because we want every mentor to be at least aware of every option available for all their mentees, so that every one of their mentees knows the pathway options and knows where to find that information and can get counseled into any one that they choose.
Can I ask a question on the opposite side of this?
Yeah, totally.
I feel like I'm trying to grill you today.
Grill me, go for it.
No, you're my friend. I like you. But like, how do we stop this from turning into the potato chip aisle? Do you know what I mean? Where you walk into that particular place and there are so many options that you kind of get paralyzed by. I think one of the things that I value, and I'll use this as preface, one of the things that I value in watching the relationships between mentors and mentees and the senior breakfast and all those things is that like these are personal relationships.
Yeah. Right.
And so like there is some aid that comes from an adult who understands the system that allows you to navigate. How do we maintain the balance so that it's not overwhelming for the student, but the student still maintains agency in that choice of now 8 pathways?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it all comes back to relationship. Like if I'm a mentor, is it my responsibility to sit down with a kid, draw out 8 pathways and say, pick an option. You're in the potato chip aisle. Do you want Lay's? Do you want Cheetos? Or do you want Doritos? Like,
don't mention them. They're not paying us.
Right.
Just kidding.
Kids are not going to know. Like if I'm a 9th grader, I have no idea. That's the nuance of being a mentor, is getting to know a student, building a relationship with them, having conferences every semester and getting to know their family and saying, how can I best support you as a mentee? How do I know the pathway that you're interested in? I mean, parents know this. Like you get to know your kids and you start to get an understanding of what ignites their passion, what gets them excited about going to school every day. How do they find that passion and direct it into something productive that you can, measure and then give them feedback on. That's the whole purpose of being a mentor. So I would argue that if we're going to use the potato chip analogy, right, the potato chip aisle or whatever, it's not about having too many potato chip options. It's about telling kids, you just tell me what you want to do with your life and I'll help you find the pathway through that. So maybe it's more like a Starbucks aisle. Like, we're going to write your name on the cup and make a custom drink for you. And you want 7 pumps of whatever and 3 pumps of this and decaf, half calf, whatever, like whatever you need, we're going to make you have it. And by the time you come into the Starbucks on the 4th time, it's not going to be this complicated drink order. It's just going to be called the Billy. Like, we know what you want. I see you coming up and I already have your drink ready because I know who you are. And that's really the goal, is that mentors get to know their students well enough. And they can only do that if you have that close relationship with a kid over 4 years.
Absolutely.
If I'm a mentor and I have 25 kids every year that I have to deeply know, 5 to 8 of them are going to graduate and 5 to 8 new ones are coming in. That's manageable for relationships, for really like deep relationships. If I'm a high school guidance counselor and I'm just going to pick on the system because I think it's inequitable and it doesn't make sense, how in the world am I going to get to know 300 kids a year when 100 of them are going to graduate or 50 are going to graduate, however many it is, and I got to learn 50 new kids? I'm going to get maybe, in the best case scenario, 1 meeting with them, maybe 2 a year.
Yeah.
So how am I really going to get to know that kid and know their family and know their story if I don't have that consistent time to really understand who they are and help guide them into one of these pathways that is navigating your future with fidelity.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear this. And I think that that's, I hate to just keep bragging on the element schools, but I think that's one of the things of significant value when you see the mentor groups.
Yeah.
Like to be placed in that in 9th grade is a huge blessing. Right.
Well, and the flip side, like you're talking about, systems that create inequity. I think if you don't intentionally build systems like that are centered around relationship and that are intentionally diverse so that students have that ability, you naturally gravitate towards the most efficient way to run a school.
Absolutely.
So you're going to say, okay, you're in charge of all the 9th graders, or you're in charge of all the IB kids. So let's put all the IB kids in one wing of the school and they have one mentor. And then we only have to train that teacher about how to run the IB test.
Yep.
And now if I don't make it into that group my 9th grade year, you're done. Like you're not going to make it into that group again. Like you missed your chance. You missed the window. It's built-in inequity in my mind.
Yeah.
And if you don't have every member of the staff counseling a group of kids on every option, they don't have to have all the answers, but they have to at least be aware. You're intentionally building a system that will funnel kids into certain pathways. And those pathways might stick and it might be the best option for a kid, and that's great. But it also might limit what they have access to based on who they happen to be placed with and what we knew about that kid coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Liz's point last time, as she joined us on the podcast, right? Like that exists long past 12th grade.
Yeah.
Right? Like when those tracks are formed.
Oh yeah, that's formative years, and those last for a lifetime.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that has become really apparent to me in the last couple of years is that students know that that's happening too. Been in a lot of conferences, been in a lot of spaces working with students and trying to do improvement to school cultures. And there was an 8th grade student, I'll leave the district unnamed, who came in and said, one of the things that's affecting us the most is like being very clear on what we're allowed to be and what we're not. And she was saying that in the tracking, right? And, a lot of schools have done it a different way. Like they've named them different schools or different academies. They've called them this. They've given them a certain color. They've done, whatever it is to try to maintain that as anonymous. But by the time that happens, I mean, we've had it in the 7th grade, right? Like we knew, that this was based on how you performed on whatever test. This is based on the GPA that you had and who your ELA teacher was going to be. But I guess coming roundabout in this conversation, my hope is that students will also now see this as an opportunity to be 8 different things.
Yeah.
And that becomes a significant form of agency with someone who's now your helper, your mentor, someone who can navigate you through.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say agency. And I think when you think about building capacity with kids and creating agency, like it's kind of a complicated thing, but the goal is that over time, kids become arbiters of their own future, that they know the pathway options that are available to them and they can navigate through systems and understand how to find what they need. And let's just be honest that there are some kids that know how to do that just fine. Some of it's based on just who they are and how they think. A lot of it's based on the family they come from and the social capital that they have to be able to navigate systems and feel comfortable navigating systems. But our goal is that every student has that agency and can navigate those systems and find the resources they need to get to where they want to be. And that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of individualization to really understand every kid and the pathway that they need. And so my hope in thinking about building agency is that something like a performance-based pathway, even if it's not a great term, will help build agency, will help kids say, this is an option. If you want to go take a test and knock it out and you feel like that's going to be fine, then move on, get to the next thing so you can navigate your future beyond high school. But if that's not an option for you, let's put together something that you can be the one driving us and telling us how you would like to be evaluated. And I don't know what that's going to look like. There's going to take some give and take with teachers, right? We're going to see the rules come out in the next couple of months and see how those rules will involve teachers setting standards and aligning learning targets to what those performance-based pathways are. But I think there's an opportunity for a lot more agency to be developed with high school students learning how to navigate and create these pathways through these systems themselves.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that would be of significant value I think for listeners within the element schools and for folks who are without, to come back and report and see how things are going in the spring.
Yeah.
Right. 2024, I think, would be the first class of individuals who get to use this as a pathway.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's available in January when they release the rules. So
I think it would be great to revisit. And I think one of the things that it would be good to model as I think you all have like a healthy, adaptive, and pretty nimble culture in each one of your schools, right? And I think that there are both adults and students who get to have input in the decisions that are made. At least that's my perception, right? And so I think it would be a great case study to come back and revisit and say, hey, here's what the rules have said. Here's how we've adapted those rules. Here's how we maintained equity within that process. And here's how we've listened to students and teachers. And here's the report on how 2024 has gone through this pathway.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being informative today, Zach.
Yeah.
I know that this is a little bit of a different spin than where we usually are, but I think it's important for us to operate in reality while talking about relationship, right? Because there's some things, again, that are above us that are going to dictate how those relationships get to look.
Yeah.
But appreciate you being able to share with us, being able to translate sometimes complicated language around house bills, and excited for our next time to be together to discuss more things on both this front and our relationship front. So thank you for spending time.
Thank you. Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education or on our website.